Welcome to episode 133 of the How Did It Happen podcast, hosted by Mike Malatesta. In this episode, Mike welcomes Kimberly Kane, the president and CEO of Kane Communications Group, an award-winning communications firm that works closely with executives to develop organizational communication frameworks and strategies that define brands, build reputations, and inspire business results.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Today, as you heard, I've got Kimberly Kane with me, and we're doing a live podcast today, which is always a treat, having done so many Zooms over the last, it's getting to be a lot of months now. So, Kimberly, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mike, and it is great to be here in person versus via Zoom. I jumped at the chance when I heard you were open to that.
Well, I'm glad that Steve Jagler brought it up, and we haven't seen each other for a long time, probably 5 years or so.
Yeah.
You look great, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
So when Steve went to work for your company, maybe at the beginning of the year or something.
January.
Yeah. So that was a long time that I talked with him, and because here we are in October. But I'm glad that he brought it up, and you were up for it, and you were open to it. So I'm very glad to have you here. And Kimberly, I start every show with the same question, and that is, how did it happen for you?
You know, it's great that you and I actually had a couple minutes to talk about this before we started recording. I ask a lot of questions, and I like to dig in and really understand what the question is all about. And the way you explained how did it all happen is about how did success happen for you. And you know, success for me, one, it's great to think that you think I'm successful because I feel like I'm constantly working at it.
Yeah.
But when I guess when I look back at the decisions I've made, the steps I've taken throughout my life, there are two things that have been constant. One, I have really high expectations. The bar always gets set higher, and I enjoy that. That's just my personality. And the second is that I don't quit. Even when I feel like I hit a wall, I don't quit. I find a way to keep going. So I think it's a combination of those two things that has enabled me to get where I am today.
Okay. So let's talk about high expectations for a minute, because a lot of people say they have high expectations, and maybe people define high expectations the way they want. So you can say they're high even if someone compared themselves to you and they would say, well, they're not really high. So tell me what you mean by high expectations, and how do you create them, and how do you sustain them?
Well, I think it's important to define success. And so you're right, high expectations are different for everyone. And for me, success in high school was always getting A's. For me, success in college was always getting A's. For me, success in athletics was setting records. So I think every one of us has to define success and expectations in a way that works, for ourselves. And mine were always setting them higher. I had a conversation with my 13-year-old daughter just this week about grades. And she's got some grades that, need to come up just a little bit. And she said to me...
To meet her expectations or yours?
Oh, there you go. Thank you very much. Let's say to meet Mom's expectations.
Okay. Yeah.
And it is really to meet my expectations to some degree, but I think we always have to stretch ourselves. And we got into a conversation about C's. And, she said, well, listen, I was talking with one of my teachers recently, and she said C's are average. And she said, well, what's wrong with being average? And I said, you've got a point, Evelyn. There's nothing wrong with being average, unless success for you is someday running a company, or unless success for you is getting a scholarship to go into college. And then a C may not, be able to get you there. So I think you want to define success and then figure out what it's going to take to get there.
So that's interesting, average, because I know that's an easy, what's wrong with average? But how do you think about average? Because I think there's nobody who wants to be average at everything. I think a lot of people, sort of like people who say, like you kind of did, well, if you think I'm successful, I thank you, but you're trying to be humble. And I think people on the average thing might be trying to be humble or one of many, when really nobody wants to feel average about everything in their life, right? Do you agree with that?
I think sometimes people don't do well under pressure. And if that's the kind of person you are, you don't do well under pressure. I think average is just fine. Sometimes average means you don't have a lot of pressure on your shoulders and you can just keep on humming along. Maybe your life is fairly predictable. And I think that's great. If that's what makes you happy, if that's what you want in your life, rock on. I think that's fantastic. But if you want to own a company, if you want to lead something, average may not cut it. So, again, I think it just comes back to defining what success looks like for you and what kind of quality of life do you want to have. Sometimes I think average is awesome. Boy, it would be nice to have a predictable life. It would be nice to, be able to say that everything is on a fairly even keel, if that's what average is. And I think for my daughter, at the age of 13, I think being average is something that is attractive to her.
Makes sense.
There's less pressure on her if she's just average. So I've got to stretch her a little bit just to think about, well, where's that going to take you in life? And are you okay with that? Because I'll support you and adore you no matter what you decide.
So have you ever read the book, The E-Myth, or The E-Myth Revisited?
I have not, but I've heard multiple people talk about it.
Okay. It was written by a guy named Michael Gerber. He's 84 years old. And I know this only because I just listened to him on a podcast this morning. And he said, when you're talking about, owning a business, it can't be average. 550,000 businesses in the United States failed last year, 2019. And his book, The E-Myth Revisited, is all about building systems into your business so that they don't fail. Mm-hmm. And I think the message that I took from that is very similar to what you were just saying there. Is if you want to be a business owner and you want to be average, this is likely the path you're going to go down. But it's not a path you have to go down. In fact, it's a path you shouldn't ever go down. Like, of course, he promotes his book, but just follow my book, and that'll never happen to you. But even with business owners, I think there's a lot of us out there that do want to be average or don't want to. They don't have the. What did you say? You said some people don't do well under pressure. They may not do well under pressure, and it's kind of. Well, I shouldn't say it's sad. It is what it is, but. Well,
and I think our employees, you look at kind of the world we're in today, and we have so many different generations in the workplace. We have this Gen Z, which is fascinating to me. So I have 4 Gen Zers. You have the millennial generation, then you have Gen Xers, which is probably where you and I are. Then you've got baby boomers, and maybe you still have some of the greatest generation. So we've got this kind of collision of people with different work ethics, different values, different expectations, in the work world. And, as leaders, not only are we leading our companies forward, creating that vision for where we're going, but we're also working to manage this, breadth of employees with different expectations in the work world. And I think you've got to be very in tune with what their expectations are. And, these young people who are coming into the work world are so savvy. They're social media savvy. They're globally astute because of the access that technology gives them. Their expectations are really high in terms of what they're expecting from their managers and from their companies. They don't want to just plug in and expect that everything's going to stay the same. They want a variety of experiences. So I think it's hard to be kind of fairly even keel or even tempo when you've got these young people on one side who are coming in, who are pushing you with a different set of expectations. And then you may have an older generation, in the workforce who, doesn't have that kind of tenacity that young people do. And so I think as leaders, it's very hard for us to be even keel or, keep things very consistent when you've got markets that are changing and such a wide variety of employees who are in the workplace today.
Yeah, that's a good point you bring up because the Gen Zers, they are used to getting any information that they need, immediately. I need to know this. I can figure it out. I get this immediately, and I think they get into, but they and they may not realize how long it takes to turn that into wisdom.
Right.
But they do know what it takes, to actually just find something out and get something done. But the workplace thing you brought up just sort of flashed into my memory that I've worked with some wonderful, wonderful people who were built like I was kind of built. You go to the office at whatever time and you work till whatever time, and you are just in your place doing that work the whole time. And then younger people come into the same workplace and they've got headphones on, right? And they've got their phone all the time and they're working in a different way.
Right.
Not a bad way or a good way, but a different way. And you have to, how do you make, because people are like, what do they do all day? They're not even like, I'm here all day working. You can see it, and because that's how they value their work, right? And the others don't. So it's not an easy thing to figure out, because you have to have people in every age group working for you. It seems like, if you want to, but getting all of them to work together and see each other's value is not simple.
No, two things I've really enjoyed, and I think they've become more clear to me how we use these tools since COVID. So, so many of us began working remotely, right, back in March. And our team has just transitioned back into the office over the past couple of months, just a staggered schedule. So, we're not all back in the office full time. But our core values have become very important in managing across all of the work that we do and managing across the generations in the workforce, because our work styles and our expectations may be different, but those core values and how we work against those core values or integrate them into how we work has to be consistent. And the other thing that has been helpful for me is Peter Drucker's a management by objective approach. So I know that's old school, but if you have, again, young people who are multitasking at all times, they're on their phones, they've got their headphones, maybe they have 2 computer screens in front of them. And then you have, people who are older or, middle-aged in the workforce. How you work really doesn't matter. Where you work also, in our industry, which is a services industry, doesn't totally matter. But are we achieving the objectives that we've set forth? That's what matters. So we found that we can manage against that, and part of the how we're doing that is through our core values.
Let's talk more about that, because core values fascinate me. They're something that everyone, every company professes to have, and oftentimes they get out of the gate with a lot of excitement, and then over time it's something on the wall, and maybe not something that everyone's living. So tell me, how did you develop what your core values or what your company's core values are, and how do you stick to it and live with them every day?
Sure. That's a great question, and one that I'm really looking forward to talking about. So, as you're probably familiar with Simon Sinek, it starts with why. And so I think before you develop your core values as a company, you want to come back to why you exist, not just what you do. What we do, we happen to be a strategic public relations and marketing agency. But why we do what we do is more important than everything. Why our clients come to us is more important than anything. And so we happen to do public relations and marketing, but why we do this is because we believe that communications is a core business strategy. We believe that communications is as important as integral to a company's success as any other function in the organization.
Every company.
Every company.
Okay.
Every company. And COVID has really put the need for great communications in the spotlight. Companies that haven't consistently communicated with employees or with their stakeholders have really struggled. The number of crises we've been pulled into over the past 6 months exceeds the number of crises we've been pulled into since the beginning of our company. And it's because many companies don't have good communications. So coming back to the why we do what we do, it's because we believe that communications is a core business strategy. And then as you get into the development of our core values, if we really deeply believe that at the heart of business needs to be good strategic communications, what are the steps that we need to be consistently taking, the values that we need to be consistently living by in order to ensure that the communications achieves business outcomes for our clients, and that our team is fully engaged in the work that we're doing. And so our core values really align with that. So they really operationalize our why, so that what we deliver is consistent.
And are your core values, do you feel like your core values are strong enough where when you see behaviors, if you do, that aren't aligning with them, someone points it out, someone says something? Because I think I find that to be hard too. We got great core values, and then you see behavior that's not consistent with the core values, and everyone's like, oh, that's just Susie, or oh, that's just whatever, and you sort of allow it, and once you allow it, well, it's hard to get back. Like being a parent, once you allow a behavior, it's hard to then change, go back and say, oh, that behavior is no good.
Yeah. So we integrate those core values into everything we do. Every Monday we have an all-team meeting, and we begin that all-team meeting by giving kudos out to team members for work that they did the week before. But you can't compliment someone for the work they did the week before just with a compliment. You've got to tie it to a core value that they were living and explain how they lived that core value. So every Monday, everyone on our team chimes in with a compliment to team members, which is really important. People are being called out for doing good work based on our core values. And then every quarter, our managers do quarterly reviews with their employees. And those quarterly reviews are focused on our core values. So it's not just what you did well and what you didn't do well. It's how what you did well aligned with our core values, and where you may have missed the boat aligned with our core values. So they really are top of mind, or more than that. I mean, they're deeply ingrained in how we do our business.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing that. So I want to go back. You mentioned with athletics, your goal is to set records. So what records have you set? What were you telling me about that?
Sure. Well, they started when I was probably 9 years old. So I actually started running track competitively when I was 6.
6?
Yeah. My dad was an Olympic hopeful who missed making the Olympic team in the pentathlon by a fraction of a second. So he was in the Olympic trials, and he was in Germany at that time in the pentathlon. And his dream, Mike, was to have boys who would follow in his footsteps. Well, guess what? He had twin daughters. And, I say this with a smile on my face because I really appreciate his honesty. He was disappointed when he had girls because he wanted those boys to follow in his footsteps. So guess what he did instead? He raised those girls only playing boys' sports. Yeah, okay. We were never allowed to play on a girls' team until, by the rules of the game, we had to play on a girls' team. But the cool thing that happened that I don't think he even expected is that girls are a lot bigger than boys, through elementary school, right? So those formative years when your self-confidence is being developed, when kind of your work ethic is being developed, he pushed us extremely hard in every single sport: football, baseball, track, soccer, always on boys' teams. But we were bigger than those boys, and we were more coordinated than those boys. And I think that just gave us the confidence to push ourselves even more. So I think we were 9 years old. My twin sister and I were running on a team. So I grew up in Los Angeles, and it was called the LA Jets. And our coach was Booker T. Woods. I'll never forget him. Just a phenomenal man. And the team, my dad actually hand-selected for us. It was one of the best AAU track teams in Los Angeles. And it was in the Central City in Los Angeles. And he put us on that team because he knew it would push us. So we always ran up in age group. And when we were 9 years old, my twin sister, Kathleen, and I, along with two gals, Tatiana and Natasha, set a world record in the 4x400 relay at Drake Stadium at UCLA for 9 and under. Okay, that was big.
That's huge.
It was huge. But, I mean, it was a testament, again, to his pushing us and to that tenacity that we had developed at that age. And, I still have pictures of that. And that really set the tone for the running the track that she and I, my twin sister and I, did throughout high school. I did go to the University of Southern California and ran track my first year, but got injured and had to stop running. So my track career ended there, which was probably good considering my major. I don't know how I would have gone into my major and also continued running track.
And what was it that when you went to USC, you mentioned your major. What was it? Well, did you and your sister think that you might make it to the Olympics when you were young? Was that a goal?
It was, yeah. But I wouldn't say it was our personal goal. It was our dad's goal.
Mm-hmm.
And, as you begin to get older, your goals begin to go in a different direction sometimes than your parents. I wouldn't say my dad stopped pushing us, but I think he realized that our goals were moving in a different direction. And as you start to get older, too, when you consider how athletic we were from such a young age, I ran my first 10K when I was 5.5 or 6 years old. It was a Christmas run in Los Angeles. I still have the T-shirt from it. Your body can only handle so much, right?
I think
again,
so, yeah.
Your joints are growing. You're going through those formative years. I don't think he realized it either. But, by the time I got into college, there was a lot of wear and tear because of those years of hard work. So it just wasn't feasible anymore.
And was track by far the one that you spent the most time on? You mentioned those other sports. When you said football, it reminded me of Katrina Cravey. I had her on the show a long time ago, and she was the quarterback of the boys' football team.
Yeah.
When she was probably around, a middle schooler, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, we stopped playing football probably 6th grade.
Okay.
Is when we stopped playing football, and got into playing tennis at that time, which I really loved. But I think you realize you can't do everything really well, right? And I joke sometimes about parenting and running a company. Like, I can't fail at either one of these. I got to kill it at both of them. But sometimes you feel like you're not doing them both really well. So, it became really clear to us, and I think even to my dad as well. You can't do every sport at the highest level. You're not wired to do every sport at the highest level. And then you don't have time. You're a human being, to do everything at the highest level. So you have to begin to prioritize. Grades were really important to me too. So, making sure that I wasn't backing off on getting really good grades. So thankfully we were able to specialize, on one sport as we got into middle school and then into high school. And then continue, focusing on getting good grades.
And if getting you and your sister into the Olympics was maybe a goal of your father's that you were trying to help him accomplish, it sounds like, what were you thinking about? What when you were in middle school or high school, what were you thinking your life would be like?
I think a lot of middle schoolers, I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking more about what was in front of me, doing a really good job at whatever was in front of me.
Okay.
It wasn't until I got into high school and started, I was a sports reporter for the local newspaper. So not just my high school newspaper, but I was a stringer for the local high school newspaper. It was a really cool opportunity.
How did you get that?
I don't know. I applied for it.
You just had expectations and you went after them.
Yeah, and I guess I was a pretty good writer.
Okay.
And I liked sports, and I think it was the Glendale News Press. I grew up I grew up in Venice Beach, and then middle school. Excuse me. We moved to an area called La Crescenta, California, and so there was the Glendale News Press, and I think that there was a local La Crescenta paper. I'll have to go back and look at my scrapbook. But yeah, they hired me as a stringer in high school to write sports. And that's when I got the journalism bug. And the reason was when I introduced myself to a parent or to a coach as a writer for this newspaper, they immediately stood up straight and took me seriously. And, as a kid, you're not used to adults standing up straight, thinking about what they're saying to you. And they did. And I thought, oh, this is kind of cool. And I started working then, writing also for the high school newspaper. And that was, part of what really got me interested in going into a career in journalism. So, as you look at kind of what my goals were and how I began to see my future, it was experiences like that in high school that made me start thinking about, where I really wanted to start focusing my attention.
Right. And this is totally unrelated, but are you a saver? Because you've mentioned several times, like I still have the T-shirt from the 10K, and you mentioned looking in your scrapbook. I'm just curious, is this just some...
Not really. I'm really selective. In fact, people who come to my house can't believe I have 4 children because, like, the stuff that 4 kids throw all over the place is like never been around my house. So I'm a selective saver. Let's put it that way. Saver. I still have my jersey from the LA Jets when I ran in my, in elementary school. So I have a few select things that I've held on to.
And okay, thank you. And you mentioned you were a stringer. I don't know what that is. What is a stringer?
Oh, kind of a freelancer. I wasn't a full-time employee
at
the high school or at the newspaper.
Okay, got it. All right, so that got the journalism bug going, and you continued with that at USC?
Yeah, so that got me introduced to journalism. And what really sealed it for me was my attending a press conference that my father was holding with LA's mayor, Tom Bradley. And my dad ran a gang prevention program, so I grew up working by his side. And he worked in housing projects like Imperial Courts and Nickerson Gardens, the birthplaces of the Bloods and the Crips. And so I grew up going into these housing projects with him, into a place called Alameda Gardens, which was also known as Dogtown, where you had, much more difficult kind of crime-focused entities operating. And his program, again, was focused on gang prevention, on ensuring kids who, were growing up in these housing projects got exposed to other things, sports and academics, and did not choose to go into gangs. And he worked very closely with USC, with the RAND Corporation, to create studies that demonstrated how successful his program was. So if the average recidivism rate or rearrest rate for youth coming out of juvenile detention was at 2% after 6 months and 50% after 2 years, actually, the average rearrest rate, I think, was 50% after 6 months and 80% after 2 years. This was back in the 1970s. His rearrest rate after 2 years was just 2%. So it was a huge difference. And so Mayor Bradley, in the late 1980s, held a press conference really declaring his program as a model for cities nationwide. And media from all over showed up. CNN was there. Network, was there. I was really proud of my dad. And it was an election year, and the mayor was being investigated for possible misdealings with a bank at that time called the Far East National Bank. And, he goes through all of the steps in the press conference. My father speaks. The kids put on a demonstration demonstrating, what they learned in the program and how the program operated. And when Tom Bradley opened it up for questions at the end, what do you think all the questions were about?
Yeah, they were about what's going on with the bank.
No questions, or very few, about my dad's program.
Yeah.
And so I had exposure as a journalist. I worked on the high school newspaper as well, and that was what sealed it for me. how could the media overlook this whole population that they complained so much about in Los Angeles? Gangs, tagging, the violence. Here's a program that clearly is setting records at reducing all of the things that we're complaining about. And the only thing you want to talk about is this election.
Right.
And so I wanted to go on to become a journalist and be a different journalist.
So you wanted to tell a different story.
Absolutely. Yeah, I wanted to focus more on solutions. I recognize that you got to talk about problems if you're going to talk about solutions, but let's not ignore the people who are doing great things in this world. Let's talk about the problems they're helping us solve.
So how did your dad get involved with that, or what caused him to start that? And for you, going into these places with your dad as a young lady, how did that feel?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I never felt unsafe. And I think it's really important for people to know that the majority of this world are good people. And I would go into these housing projects. We would go into the basements of churches for food and for meetings, and never, ever felt unsafe. And so many people believed in the work that he was doing because they saw how it transformed the young people in their communities. I have stories I could share with you about that. But he was an athlete, as you know, and he was doing some marketing work for the LA Forum. This is before I was born. And while he was doing that marketing work with the LA Forum, he also volunteered with a program called the Kennedy Child Study Center, which was a program for youth who had cognitive and emotional disabilities. And he always liked to play basketball with these kids. Mm. And there was one kid in particular he was called John the Robot. And John's disability prevented him from thinking on his own, doing things on his own. He would do things when he was told. John, tie your shoes. John, brush your teeth. But he would only do things when he was told. So my dad liked to play basketball with John. And he would put the basketball in John's hands, and he would help John make the basket. And there was one time he said he helped John make the basket, and then John made the basket, and my dad picked him up and swung him around and said, "John, you did it. John, you did it. Do you want to do it again?" And John reached out on his own. And according to the folks who were there, his counselors, John had never done that before. Mm. So that immediately sealed in my dad's mind the connection between positive reinforcement and action. And if we're not giving people positive reinforcement for the actions that they're taking that are good actions, they might not do them again. So that was one impulse for him. The next impulse that then led to the creation of Direction Sports was running on the beach. He was running on the beach in the late 1960s, and this was something he did every day. He would go down to Venice Beach and run. And parked his car, did his traditional run, came back to get his car, and his car was gone. The car was stolen. So he did what everybody does, right? Called police, put out a report, and they found his car. They eventually found his car, and they found the person who stole his car. And the person who stole his car turned out to be a 16-year-old orphan by the name of Lloyd Camachi. And my dad goes into court along with my mom when this kid is going to be sentenced to whatever sentence he's going to get. And it was during that court proceeding that my dad learned that Lloyd was an orphan. And he stood up during the proceeding and said, well, if he's an orphan, I'll adopt him. He and my mom were there. We'll adopt Lloyd. We'll give him a home. And the judge stopped the court proceeding and said, whoa, let's go in the back chamber and have a conversation about this. Let's talk about this. And my dad was told, so the defense attorney's there, the prosecutor's there, the judge is there. And my parents were told, listen, if this kid had come from a middle-class background, he would have been released to his parents on probation. But he's not from a middle-class background. He's, a juvenile delinquent. He lives on the streets. Listen, he automatically gets a year. The laws are intended to protect people like you. Mm. And my father was horrified by that. He had studied law. He decided not to go on and become an attorney. But he said that experience, impacted him so deeply that it changed the course of his life. So recalling the the positive impact that, John the robot making the basket had. Looking at a kid like Lloyd, he thought, how many positive experiences did this kid have in his life? He's an orphan and he's 16 and he's on the streets.
Right.
So he left his career and he started Direction Sports. This was during the Great Society when there was a lot of money coming into America's inner cities. And at that time, my father said, listen, if we've got so much money coming into the inner cities for midnight basketball programs and midnight football programs, how many of these youth in the inner cities are actually going to go on to make a professional living in professional sports? And it turned out very few. So he said, let's start this program that combines sports with academics. We'll use the magnetism of sports to attract kids into the program, but we'll create an academic component that's based on what they're learning in school. So we'll get them into the program, we'll create this academic component, and then we'll put a lot of emphasis on positive reinforcement. And it was transformative. So for me, growing up, every Saturday, every Sunday, I traveled with him to the youth prisons in North Carolina, traveled with him to New York as he got these programs off the ground.
So he was doing programs in multiple states.
He grew Direction Sports into a national entity in the early 1980s.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you were following him along. We're opening this up. I'm going along with you. Did your sister come as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, he just took us with him. So we were in the housing projects, Cabrini Green in Chicago. Yeah, he did some work with Jesse Jackson in Operation Push at that time. So, you don't think a lot about your childhood when you're in it, but I look back on it, and it was certainly a very unique experience.
A lot different than USC.
A lot different than USC, yeah. That's for sure. But, going to USC enabled me to actually work for my dad in college. So.
Oh, okay, because you were close.
That was my college job. Yeah, I was actually running one of the summer arts programs in one of the housing projects.
So you wanted to be a different kind of journalist, and you became a journalist.
Exactly. Yeah, loved it.
Tell me more.
Yeah, so my goal was to focus on solutions. My goal was to not just go out and tell stories about the problems, was to look for what else was out there, what was behind it. And I learned you can't be that naive, Kimberly, right? The industry works the way it works for a reason. But I did have the chance to do both. I did have the chance to cover breaking news and some difficult stories, but also to take a look at what's really going on, to take a look at who are those people who are really making an impact, if these are the problems that we have to solve, and tell those stories as well. Coming here to Milwaukee gave me the chance to start the For Your Health franchise at WTMJ TV, and that was amazing. It gave me the chance, in that work to not just focus on difficult diseases or, difficult developments in healthcare, but to really learn about, how we should be using healthcare. Just because your child has an ear infection doesn't mean you need to go in to see a physician, doesn't mean you need antibiotics, and to really help re-educate people or just educate them on the whys in the house of healthcare. And that was an honor for me, to never do the story that was obvious, but to do the story that really could empower people with information they may not have.
And how, so you were in... So you were telling a lot of stories I know you were the medical, I don't want to get the title wrong, were you the...
Healthcare reporter.
Healthcare reporter.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this might be an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Of the things that you were exploring as the healthcare reporter, what's been the thing that's actually happened that's most amazed you? So something that at the time you were reporting it was a problem that couldn't be solved, for example, and now fast forward however many years, and now it's a problem that's been solved.
Oh, wow. I think the human genome, when I was first beginning to report,
okay.
That was something the Medical College of Wisconsin was really getting involved with. And now we have the human genome sequenced, and we're able to put together genetic therapies. That has been amazing.
Yeah. Game changer.
Game changer.
Right.
Yeah. And I think, the way women are treated in science and in medicine, women had been considered kind of small versions of men. And today we see so many more therapies and treatments that are customized for women based on how women are. You look at heart attacks, for example. The symptoms that women have are often different than the symptoms that men have. But even when I was beginning to report on healthcare, that wasn't as widely understood, and today it is. So those are just a couple of examples of developments. Healthcare to me is fascinating because we are learning so much about science, learning so much about the human body. And, the science builds on itself. So things that we've discovered, you continue to study them or watch the efficacy and refine the work. And, there are cures today for diseases that we never thought we could cure. There are treatments today that are extending people's lives and the quality of their lives that we never imagined. I think the understanding of nutrition as well. Some of the foods maybe we don't all like to eat, like kale, right?
Yeah.
I think we know a lot more about how nutrition impacts our brains and our bodies.
Yeah, I just did a podcast last week with a guy named Naveen Jain, and he founded a company called Viome. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's basically a gut microbiome gene sequencing. So they're not sequencing genes, they're sequencing bacteria in your gut to help you figure out what, from a nutritional standpoint, what your body actually needs versus what it doesn't. And his sort of thing was that everybody is customized just like every person is, the inside. But he believes, to the nutrition thing, which fascinated me, he believes that, food is the solution to many illnesses, maybe all illnesses, he might even say, chronic illnesses and such, which is, I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that, but when you mention nutrition and stuff, there are answers in food that I don't think, they're certainly not marketed at it. We get different marketing when it comes to food than answers to how to be, optimize your customized gut, for example.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges we have is we're all so busy and we don't press pause to think about what our bodies and our minds need. I never really paid attention to that until I'd say the past 6 months or so.
Okay.
When, you're running on empty at all times, right? You don't feel like you're thinking as critically as you should be. You don't feel like you're there for everyone you need to be. But then you take a look at your lifestyle and you go, okay, maybe there are some things I need to do. I need to recognize and respect the fact that I'm a human being. I'm not a robot. And I've got to treat myself that way and with respect. And that began my personal focus more on nutrition. And then also giving myself a break, Mike. I think those of us who tend to push ourselves, we don't recognize that we need to give ourselves breaks. So setting a schedule, again, I try to work out every Tuesday morning and every Thursday morning, or at least take my dogs for a walk so I can ease into the day. You got to find what works for you and give yourself permission to do it.
So we were talking about high expectations at the beginning, so I'm sure that doesn't, so I'm thinking, do you let yourself lower the bar for a little bit of time just to give yourself a break, or is there some other way that you deal with sort of, I'm a high expectation person, but sometimes you need to, well, we were talking about average, I'm not saying we have to go there, but sometimes you need to be okay with not, getting over the bar today.
Well, I think it goes back to defining success. And for me, if defining success is operating at 100%, what do I need to operate at 100%?
Right.
And operating at 100% doesn't mean I'm on 24/7, but it means that when I'm on, I'm on.
Yeah.
And so what do I need to get there? And I think because of my training as an athlete, I'm really in tune with kind of when things are working and when they're not working. And if they're not working, just like if I have an injury, I'm going to stop and I'm going to think about that. I'm going to look at that, and I'm going to see what I need to do to make it work the way I need it to work again.
Yeah.
And if I'm not as focused as I need to be focused, if I'm dragging, I got to try something different.
I call that being selfish, but in a positive way, because selfish has such a negative connotation to it. But as a high performer or as a leader or anybody really, unless you know how to take care of yourself, you're not likely to take care of a lot of other people very well.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. And every one of us needs to give ourselves permission to do that. As a parent, if you are drained, you're probably going to snap at your kids a little bit, right?
Good
Yeah.
point.
You're not going to stay on top of things. They deserve me. They did, to take care of myself. They need me to take care of myself. So I think every one of us has to press pause for just a minute and think about that. I think you also have to think about, how your work fits into that. I think there are some, employers that don't recognize that their team members have lives outside of work. And I'm really working hard to create an environment in our company that recognizes I've got human beings on the team, and sure, we could sell more, sure, we could deliver more, but I want my people to feel like I really respect who they are and really respect what they bring to the table. I'm not going to drive them that hard. I want them to have balance.
Right. So balance is interesting because, as I understand the life of a journalist, particularly a television journalist, there's you have to be where you have to be when you have to be there, right? There's not a lot of, well, there may be balance to it, but there's not a lot of freedom, what I would call freedom to that. So you left that industry and that opportunity at some point. What was the reason for that?
Yeah. So that was my dream job. So if going to the Olympics was my dad's dream for me, becoming a journalist was my dream for me. And I loved it. And I worked more hours than you can imagine in that industry, not because I felt I had to, but because I loved it. But it takes a toll on you. Like big time takes a toll on you when you're pushing yourself that hard. And so I went into preterm labor with my first child a month early. I was put on bed rest. And I know why. I was working crazy hours, 16 hours a day. So when baby number 4 was on her way, so I have 3 boys and then a little girl, I had to face that fact. Do I want to continue, growing my career, get to a bigger market if that's what I want to do? Or do I need to take a change in direction? I had 3 young boys at that time and a little girl on the way. And the choice was really easy for me. Being more involved in their lives was important to me. And so that was the decision I made. And, it wasn't easy. But when I looked at the soccer games I was missing and, not knowing what their schedules were, there was a responsibility. I had a responsibility to be their mom, not just to have them. And I wanted to immerse myself in that.
How long did it take you to think about making that change? And I ask because, whenever you're successful in anything, it begins to define you a little bit. And it's status, it's how you think about yourself, it's how people think about you. It's a big decision. It's a big, even when you've got this, exceptional motivation too in these 4 children. How long did it take you to really work it through?
Yeah, I guess I'd have to think about that. There was a new news director at Channel 4 at that time who had, I think, a different set of expectations. And, the balance that I was finding I needed in my life was not aligning with his expectations for the work. And that felt unfair to me at that time. Now that I'm an employer, I look at it differently. I get it. I get why he had that expectations. Okay. And so it was just a choice. That career no longer aligned with my needs as a person. And I think the expectations he had were right on for the job. It was no longer the right job for me.
Okay, interesting. So that's the wisdom showing up after some time in a different experience, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And the logic, right? It's the context, right? That comes from, right? Now the shoes are on a different foot. Yeah. And I get it.
So what made you want to start Kane Communications?
So you and I first met when I was in the recruiting industry.
Yes.
So when I left TMJ, I took some time off to really think about what that next position needed to be for me. I did interview for some jobs with TV stations in other parts of the country, but it was clear the expectation was going to be the same as it was at TMJ, and that wasn't the right expectation for me. So I went into executive search with Cindy Lou, who to this day remains like one of the greatest mentors of my life. Mm-hmm. I learned everything about business from her, and I sometimes wondered, well, what am I doing in the recruiting industry when I'm a trained journalist? I'm a trained communicator. And, she said, your penchant for asking really tough questions at the highest level and your love of research will really make you good for this job. And she was right. I didn't shy away from asking CEOs really tough questions. And those CEOs needed to be asked those tough questions in order for us to define the job correctly, or to understand why these positions were so hard to fill, or why there was such high turnover rate. We can't dance around the facts. We can't dance around reality because you have a title. I'm here to do a job, and if I'm going to do my job, I've got to ask you these questions. And I loved it. I loved the time that I spent with Cindy and the Novo Group. I loved helping businesses solve problems. So when I was in the world of reporting, I was reporting on stories, but I wasn't actually solving problems. And as a recruiter, I was actually solving problems. Companies weren't able to meet sales quotas because they didn't have the right talent on their team, or they weren't able to retain employees because they weren't hiring the right employees. So it was great for me to be able to get in at the highest level, mm-hmm. learn about business, and really apply those abilities to ask tough questions and do research in a different way. I kept on getting pulled in, though, to solving problems I wasn't hired to solve, right? So companies sometimes had a hard time hiring employees because they didn't have a great employer brand. They didn't have a great employer value proposition. So I would sometimes consult with the HR teams or even the CEO on developing that kind of public relations or a plan or community relations plan, or, redefining their employer value proposition. And that actually got me hired away by one of my clients to develop that kind of program for her company. She said, I don't have somebody on my team who can actually do this, so why don't you come back into the world of communications and take on a community relations and government affairs position is what I did. So that was my foray back into the world of communications. And then
that was at Doman.
That was at Doman. Yeah. And it was amazing for me to be able to work with that team. That was my first work with core values. And I was in charge of a core values program, really aligning behaviors and recognizing positive behaviors for living those core values. And then I had the chance to travel to, I think at that time, Doman had 4 or 5 cities, meet with nonprofits in those communities and help pull back their philanthropy from being philanthropy that often went to nonprofits overseas to bring their corporate giving back here into the U.S. at the cities where they had locations, and begin to build out that great kind of employer profile for them. One thing that Cynthia used to say is, we're a 5 generations old company. Why don't people in Milwaukee know us that well? And so being able to bring back their philanthropy and help them build out a more visible presence here in Milwaukee was something I got to start work with them. And then from there, I left and started Kane. And again, my goal at that time was to be able to spend more time with my kids. I used to bring my kids into Doman with me on the weekends, and they would say to me, is this a 1 DVD day or a 3 DVD day? And right, exactly. And, I realized, again, that whole work ethic thing was something that I constantly fought, and success was always higher and higher and higher, which meant I was working more and more and more. Right. And again, I wasn't able to be there, or wasn't there as present in the lives of my little people. And so when I started Kane, my goal was just to be a consultant. I just wanted to spend time consulting with companies that I really believed in, working with CEOs that I really believed in, helping them align communications with their business plan to achieve objectives. But communications today, and you know this, I'm sure well, Mike, is not siloed. It's not just employee communications or public relations or social media or marketing. Really effective communications today is integrated. So you have to have a set of core principles and goals and objectives for your comms. But then to execute it, it's often done on multiple platforms, through the press, through activating your brand, through community relations, through social media, through your employee communications. So guess what happened?
Yeah, you're not just a consultant.
I'm not just a consultant. And, every project became bigger as I peeled back the layers of the onion. Every project became much bigger than me.
Right.
And so I would begin to bring consultants on to help me with these projects. But you realize, and if you're hiring consultants to do multiple aspects of these projects, you're giving up a lot of margin. And you're also giving up a lot of control because those consultants have other jobs that they're working on, other clients that they have to please. And maybe they're a smaller piece of your project, so you may not get the attention and your client therefore may not get the attention.
Right, or their core values might not align with yours all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So after 2 years of being a consultant and bringing other consultants on to help me out, I finally had enough business to turn one of our contractors into a full-time employee. And we grew from 2 to 5 people over the course of 2 years. And then in 2018, we hired 12 people. And now we're at about 20 employees on the team. And I think that's a pretty good number. I'm really proud to say we haven't had to let anybody go through COVID. I'm proud to say that nobody's had to take a concession in terms of salary. The work ethic that I've seen of this team, the investment, being invested is one of our core values. And being invested at Kane means you don't let anybody fail. And to see the kind of teamwork, the kind of collaboration, the kind of problem solving among these employees through the past 6 months or so has been amazing and humbling.
Surprising?
Surprising. Not when you know these people. When you get to know everybody on the Kane team, no, this is how they're wired. This is who they are. They're athletes in many ways.
Okay, yeah. So they're and this may not be everybody, but me, when I think about communications, I think about public relations, and I think about, maybe crisis. When your company's in the news in a bad way, which has happened to me, it's you need somebody who knows what they're doing. But as I was going through what some of the things that Kane does, and when you started talking about your experience as a recruiter, it started to come together for me a little bit, because I wrote some of these down, like creating a wellness program, helping a company create a wellness program, helping a hospital with their image as a thought leader, developing that, managing and developing crisis, of course, a global distribution company reconnecting with their customers, and rebuilding an organization's reputation. I thought that's much more of a breadth of services or specialties to offer than what I had traditionally thought of as a communications company.
Yeah, right. And many people don't realize how integrated communications is today, and they see it as silos, public relations or crisis comms or marketing. But, today your company and my company, we are experiences, right?
Yeah.
We have a brand that people can either relate to and connect with or not. And it's our responsibility as companies to define that brand. Because if we don't define that brand, someone else will define it, or a crisis will define it. And so your brand is your promise, and it's that experience that people, again, engage with. And so your communications has to enable that. It has to activate that. And, we are able to activate companies' brands in a number of different ways. based on their objectives. So one company's objective may be to fill every single nursing position on every single shift. And so we're going to activate their brand one way to achieve that. Another company's objective may be to launch their products into a new market. And so we'll activate their brand differently for that.
Well, that's a good point you bring up too, because so many people think about communication as always being external, but some of the things you just mentioned and in here, you actually need to communicate internally with your people to either build a brand that people want to work with. Forget about whether they want to buy from you; they want to work for you. And also, like some of the things you talked about before when you were recruiting. There's a reason that you have a high turnover here. It's not because people love you.
Right.
So what are we going to do about that?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Who are you and what do you stand for?
Right.
And many organizations see brands as a logo or a tagline.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. But it's not. And, especially if you need me to come in and save you during a crisis, I really want you to have a well-defined brand because I'm going to take a look at how you've lived your core values. And if you haven't lived your core values, it's harder for me to protect you. If you have lived those core values, I can step out and say, take a look at our track record, take a look at our history. Here's how we've consistently treated our employees. Here's how we've consistently treated our suppliers, depending on whatever the crisis is. I really want that track record. And that's going to help me protect your reputation and help you rebuild it much more quickly than if you don't have that brand and those core values in place to begin with.
Good advice.
Take it seriously.
Yeah, take it seriously.
And that's free advice.
Kimberly, thank you so much for being on the show today. How can people connect with you? What's the best way for people to engage with you or your company?
Well, thanks, Mike, for such a great conversation. You made it so easy, and I know we covered a lot of ground, so I really appreciate the time that you've spent with me today as well. Best way to connect with us would be by giving us a call at 414-635-7000 or visiting our website at kanecomgroup.com. You can learn a lot about who we are and what we do. Follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram as well. All of those are at KaneCom Group.
Okay. LinkedIn, are you on LinkedIn?
Yes. How could I forget LinkedIn?
Yes.
Of course we're on LinkedIn. Or find me on LinkedIn,
Yeah.
Kimberly Kane on LinkedIn, or find me on any of my social profiles as well. Shoot me a message on Facebook Messenger. You'll probably get me faster by messaging me on Facebook Messenger than any other way.
Okay. Well, there you go. Facebook Messengers. I'm so happy to have reconnected with you and had you on today. I'm also happy to get out of here before I give you a chance to ask me a tough question, because I've been a little scared of that ever since you said that's one of your
Don't
specialties.
challenge me on that
No,
front,
no.
Mike. Come on.
We're going to get out of here. So, Kimberly, thanks so much.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the How Did Happen podcast, where we believe that success doesn't happen unless you make it happen. You can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to listen. And while you're there, please rate it and leave a comment as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the show, ideas for future guests, or whatever you'd like to share. And of course, you can always find me at MikeMalatesta.com. See you next time. Thanks again for listening to the How Did Happen podcast.